Welcome to Lord Nightmare channel. We share scary stories with rainy ambience. I hope this video helps you in some way to sleep, relax, or just be entertained for a while. If you enjoy it, please think about subscribing and hitting the thumbs up button to help my channel out. Now let's begin.
Vacations are supposed to be relaxing, right? A break from the grind. That's exactly what I was looking for when I booked a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods. A place where I could unplug, unwind, and just be. But by the end of my first night there, I wasn't relaxing. I was running for my life. It all started off perfectly normal. The cabin was picture perfect. Rustic, cozy, surrounded by dense forest, and completely cut off from the world. The nearest town was over 30 minutes away, and the road to the cabin was so narrow and winding that it felt like driving into another world. Exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. By the time I unpacked, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, and the shadows outside stretched long and dark. It was so quiet. Not peaceful quiet, unnatural quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. Just nothing. I told myself it was fine, that I wasn't used to this kind of silence after years in the city. But it didn't sit right. Around 8 p.m., I was curled up on the couch with a book when I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a single sharp tap on the door. My heart jumped. Who would knock on the door of a cabin this far out? I hesitated, staring at the door. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. I got up and peeked through the window. Nothing. Just the dense forest and the faint glow of the porch light. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe it was a branch falling. Or a bird. Yeah, bird. I went back to the couch, trying to focus on my book, but the silence felt heavier, like the air itself was watching me. Then, a sound shattered the stillness. A low, deliberate scratching at the door. It wasn't frantic, like an animal. It was slow, purposeful, like someone was dragging a nail down the wood. My chest tightened as I froze in place. Someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. No bars. I wasn't surprised, but it still made my stomach drop. I turned off the lights, hoping whoever, or whatever, was outside wouldn't see me. Sitting there in the dark, I strained to hear. And that's when I noticed it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Crunch, fuzz, crunch, fuzz. I couldn't move. My entire body was tense, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. Whoever it was circled the cabin twice, then stopped right outside the living room window. I could feel them standing there, watching. My pulse pounded in my ears as I slid lower on the couch, trying to stay out of sight. The footsteps eventually moved away, and I thought it was over. But then I heard a whisper. A low, raspy voice, just outside the door. "Let me in." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The voice didn't shout or plead. It was calm. Too calm. Like it already knew the answer. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying not to make a noise. The voice came again, softer this time, almost playful. "Let me in. I know you're there." My chest felt like it was going to explode. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and crouched in the corner of the room, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. The voice kept repeating those same words, each time sounding closer to the windows. And then, silence. I stayed frozen for hours, too afraid to move. The voice didn't come back, and I eventually convinced myself it had gone. Exhausted, I somehow drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the windows. I felt a momentary rush of relief. Maybe it was all a bad dream. But then I saw the door. It was covered in scratches. Deep, jagged gouges running from top to bottom. My stomach lurched as I stepped outside. The gravel path around the cabin was disturbed, like someone, or something, had been pacing. And then I saw them, bare footprints, leading from the woods to the cabin. But what made my blood run cold was that there were no footprints leading back into the woods. Whoever had been there was still out here. I didn't waste another second. I threw my stuff into the car and sped down the dirt road as fast as I could, the trees blurring past me. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something running after me. When I reached the main road, I finally let myself breathe. I pulled over to the side and sat there, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold all over again. I'd locked the cabin door before I left, but in my rush to escape, I hadn't unlocked it. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. I was driving cross-country, taking my time, enjoying the open road. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, along a desolate stretch of Route 22, I realized I'd miscalculated the timing. Night was falling fast, and the nearest town was still hours away. When I saw the flickering neon sign for a motel up ahead, I felt relieved. It wasn't listed on any map I checked, but at that moment, I didn't care. The sign read, "Rest Easy Motel." Vacancy. The place looked old, the kind of motel that had probably seen better days in the 70s. The paint on the building was peeling, and only half the neon letters were lit. But I figured it was better than sleeping in my car. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mildew, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The man behind the counter looked up as I walked in. He was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken. He gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, too tired to notice how strange he looked. He slid an old-fashioned key across the counter and said, "Room 6. Down the hall." The hallway leading to my room was dimly lit and lined with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. As I walked to room 6, I noticed something strange. Every door I passed was slightly ajar. I peeked into one, expecting to see an empty room, but instead, I saw nothing. Just darkness. Not the kind of darkness you get when the lights are off, but an impenetrable void, like the room didn't exist at all. My unease grew, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. I reached my room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was small and bare, with a bed, a nightstand, and a single lamp. The air was heavy, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. I shut the door and locked it, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. As I unpacked my bag, I noticed something odd. The mirror on the wall wasn't reflecting the room properly. It showed my bed and my belongings, but there was something else in the reflection. A shadow in the corner. My heart stopped. I spun around, but the corner was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was overtired from the long drive. I turned off the light, crawled into bed, and pulled the covers over my head like a child afraid of the dark. But sleep didn't come easily. Somewhere in the silence, I heard it. A faint whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind outside. But then I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the walls. Soft, unintelligible voices, murmuring just beneath the surface. I strained to make out the words, but they were too faint, too jumbled. I turned on the light, my heart pounding. The room was silent again. My hands were trembling as I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm myself down. That's when I heard it, the distinct sound of a door creaking open. It wasn't my door. It was one of the doors in the hallway. The whispers grew louder, almost like they were moving closer. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. My screen flickered and went black. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my door. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. I wanted to shout, "Who's there?" but the words caught in my throat. I stepped toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. That's when I heard it, a voice on the other side, low and raspy, barely above a whisper. "Let us in." My blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the knocking grew more frantic, the door rattling on its hinges. The whispers were back now, louder, coming from all around me. I stumbled back, tripping over the nightstand, and fell to the floor. The light flickered, plunging the room into darkness. And then silence. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it didn't. Instead, I noticed something far worse. The mirror. The reflection. There was someone standing behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer now, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its face obscured by shadow. My body was frozen in terror as the figure in the mirror raised a hand and pointed at me. I didn't think. I just ran. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the room, not even bothering to grab my things. The hallway was pitch black now, and the whispers were deafening, like they were inside my head. The doors I'd passed earlier were wide open, and as I ran by, I caught glimpses of them, not rooms, but voids, endless and empty, sucking in the light. The front desk was empty when I reached the lobby. The man was gone, and so was the neon sign outside. The motel looked different, more rundown, like it hadn't been used in decades. I didn't stop to question it. I jumped in my car and peeled out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. When I finally made it to the next town, I stopped at a diner to collect myself. I told the waitress about the motel, about what I'd seen, and she just stared at me, her face pale. "There's no motel on Route 22, she said quietly. "Hasn't been for years. It burned down back in the 80s. Everyone inside, they..." Last summer, I decided to rent a cabin by a lake for a weekend. It was the perfect escape from work, city noise, and people. The lake was remote, tucked deep in the woods, and the cabin was small but cozy, perched right on the water's edge. It was exactly what I needed: solitude, silence, and the kind of peace you only find far away from civilization. Or at least, that's what I thought. I arrived just before sunset. The lake was beautiful, the surface smooth as glass, reflecting the fiery orange and pink of the sky. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a loon. It felt untouched, like I was stepping into a forgotten corner of the world. But as I stood there on the dock, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle, like the way the air felt heavier than it should, or how the silence seemed to press against my ears. I chalked it up to being alone in such an isolated spot and headed inside the cabin. It was rustic but comfortable, with just the basics: a bed, a kitchen, and a small living area. The windows faced the lake, giving me a stunning view. As night fell, I made myself dinner and sat by the window, staring out at the dark water. It was eerily still. No ripples, no movement. Just a black, glassy surface that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. That's when I noticed it. A faint ripple, right in the middle of the lake. It started small but grew wider, like something, or someone, was swimming just beneath the surface. My heart skipped. It couldn't have been a fish. The ripple was too deliberate, too slow. I leaned closer to the window, squinting, but whatever caused the ripple was gone. I shook it off and went to bed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But sleep didn't come easily. The cabin creaked and groaned, the way old buildings do, but it sounded almost deliberate, like footsteps moving through the wood. At one point, I thought I heard something scrape against the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the lake, calm and dark under the moonlight. When I woke up the next morning, I decided to take the canoe out on the lake, hoping it would help clear my head. The water was unnervingly still as I paddled, my reflection rippling beneath me. The air was so quiet it felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. I reached the center of the lake, paused, and let the canoe drift. That's when I saw it. Beneath me, just a few feet below the surface, was a shape. It was pale and distorted by the water, but it was unmistakably human. A face, staring up at me. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, its mouth slightly open as if frozen in a scream. I screamed and nearly tipped the canoe. When I looked again, the face was gone, the water smooth as if nothing had ever been there. My heart was racing as I paddled back to shore, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the oar. Back in the cabin, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games. But deep down, I knew better. I spent the rest of the day indoors, too shaken to go back outside. By evening, the oppressive silence had returned, thicker than before. It felt like the lake, and whatever was in it, was watching me. That night, I heard it again, the scraping at the window. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The scraping stopped, and then came a new sound, knocking. Soft, deliberate knocks at the cabin door. "Hello," a voice called out. It was low, rasping, and faintly distorted, like it was coming from underwater. I didn't move. I didn't answer. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the door with their fists. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then I heard it, footsteps, wet and heavy, circling the cabin. They stopped just outside the bedroom window. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I might see. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale, waterlogged, and grinning. Its eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking. I don't remember grabbing my car keys or running out the door. All I know is I was suddenly in my car, speeding down the dirt road, my hands trembling so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it, the figure standing on the shore of the lake watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin, but the nightmares haven't stopped. I still see that face sometimes, staring up at me from the darkness. And I swear, on nights when it's quiet, I can hear the faint sound of knocking and the voice, low and raspy, whispering, "Come back." I don't scare easily. I've camped in the woods, hiked alone at night, and driven down countless empty roads. But this was different. This is the story of the time I ventured onto a hiking trail that doesn't show up on any map. A trail that whispers and watches and follows. It started like any normal day. I'd been driving through the mountains, looking for a good spot to stretch my legs and clear my head. After an hour or so, I found a small parking lot with a trailhead sign that just said, "The Ridge Trail." I didn't think much of it. There were no other cars in the lot, and no mention of the trail on the guidebook I'd been using, but I thought, great, a quiet, undiscovered hike. The first half hour on the trail was fine, peaceful even. The trees were thick, their canopies blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and still, but as I walked further, the woods started to feel wrong. The usual sounds of nature, birds, wind, insects, were gone. Instead, there was just this oppressive silence, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft that at first I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. I stopped walking, straining to listen. The whisper came again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. Faint, overlapping whispers, as if a dozen people were murmuring just out of sight. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me. But the trail was empty. Just endless trees stretching back the way I came. That's when I noticed the shadows. They didn't look right. The sun was barely peeking through the trees, but the shadows cast on the ground were long and jagged, like they were being pulled in directions they shouldn't be. Some of them didn't even line up with the trees. I brushed it off as my imagination and kept walking, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. And then I saw it. Up ahead, there was a figure standing in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought it was another hiker. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure was motionless, too still. Their head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and their arms hung limp at their sides. I called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" But they didn't move. They didn't respond. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. That's when I saw their face. Or rather, the lack of it. The figure's face was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched where features should have been. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The whispers around me turned into hissing laughter. And then, just like that, the figure was gone. I blinked, and the trail was empty again. At that point, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. I turned around and started back down the trail, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a run. But the forest didn't feel the same. The trees seemed closer now, their trunks twisting unnaturally, their branches reaching out like claws. The shadows moved even when I didn't, stretching across the trail and curling around my feet like they were trying to hold me in place. The whispers followed me the entire way. Sometimes they sounded far away, like they were coming from deep in the woods. Other times, they were right behind me, so close I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. At one point, I glanced over my shoulder and saw another figure, a shadowy shape darting between the trees, always just out of sight. When I finally reached the parking lot, I jumped into my car and slammed the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the trailhead sign. It didn't say "to the Ridge Trail" anymore. The words had changed. It said, "Welcome back." I haven't been able to get that hike out of my mind. I don't know what I experienced on that trail, or what would have happened if I'd stayed any longer. But one thing is for sure, I'm never going back. Have you ever had an experience like this? Something that felt impossible? Or like you were being watched by something you couldn't explain? Let me know in the comments. Share your stories because I'd love to hear them. And if you're brave enough, send this video to someone who loves hiking alone. Let's see if they dare to take the Whispering Trail.